Obligatory biographical intro. I have always had trouble enjoying city builder games. I played them, don't get me wrong. As a child, I spent many a summer afternoon in the warm glow of a CRT monitor, playing SimCity or Pharaoh on my dad's computer. But at heart, I was always an Age of Empires player. City builders lacked something, and it's only decades later as an adult that I can finally put it into words why I disliked them so much. Dislike them is a harsh word. I enjoyed them, but they felt unsatisfying. They felt sterile and empty. And it turns out, it's for the exact same reason that I find them so fascinating now. Their relationship with ideology. A lot of games try to deal with ideology explicitly. Games like BioShock, Disco Elysium, Cruelty Squad, and Deus Ex are a few quintessential examples of quote-unquote political games. They are explicitly about ideology and politics. They tell you this plainly on their surface. It's part of their marketing. And so if you're a young person who's just starting to take an interest in politics, you might gravitate towards some of these games. Sort of like how newly politically interested young people will often gravitate to certain writers like Orwell, Huxley, maybe even someone like Ayn Rand, or maybe even they'll take a superficial interest in Marx. The political significance of writers like these is part of the cultural zeitgeist. It doesn't take a lot of work to figure out that they're important. Their books are often explicitly marketed as political. By the same token, what I would personally argue are often much more politically interesting novelists, people like D.H. Lawrence, Jane Austen, Thomas Mann, or Leo Tolstoy, typically will get ignored by these politically interested young people because they are not marketed that way. They're literature, say. Occasionally, someone like Jordan Peterson will boost someone like Dostoevsky to popular awareness, but generally, people look for political thoughts and ideas in books that are explicitly marketed as political. Similarly, while a game like BioShock has the popular mystique and curiosity about Ayn Rand and objectivism as a literal part of its market appeal, nobody really talks about the politics behind what makes a city in SimCity, say, have a low happiness rating, or the deep social implications in how crime is managed in Frostpunk 2. You lower crime by having more city guards. And the reason for this, I think, is despite the obvious connection between city building games and politics, where you are literally constructing and managing cities, city building games are not really marketed as political at all. And for this reason, I will argue that city builders are actually the most ideologically slanted video games there are. It is the most political genre. So without further ado, let's get into it. To start with, what if I told you that city building games are not really about building cities at all? I'm tempted to say they're not actually about anything. City builder games, as a rule, rather than functioning as accurate simulations of how city construction, planning, and management work, more closely resemble open-ended puzzle games. They merely use urban settings as a theme. At its core, a city building game is about cleverly assembling networks of connections to balance flows of resources. This can be revenue, population, happiness, pollution, crime. All of these are abstract reductions to numerical balances of things that in the real world are endlessly complicated and concrete. Compare, by contrast, to any number of open-ended puzzle games that are actually marketed as puzzle games. Let's take Zachtronics' Opus Magnum, for example, an alchemy-themed puzzle game based around simple programming and spatial reasoning. In Opus Magnum, you build machines that pick up, manipulate, and transform resources in order to create desired outputs. You do this on a single flat plane, arranged onto a grid. You assign conduits. You place down structures to transform resources from one into another, exchanging them in order to form the most economical machine possible. This, I argue, is how city builder games work. They are not about cities. They are about machines. For example, let's take the popular city builder game City Skylines, in which players have to manage not just the flow and exchange of resources, but also pollution. Let's talk about how City Skylines deals with pollution. There are three kinds: ground pollution, water pollution, and noise pollution. If, for example, residential zones are placed too near to commercial districts, which includes everything from big box stores to little hole-in-the-wall restaurants, to information centers, cafes, and bookshops, they become afflicted with noise pollution. Noise pollution negatively impacts population happiness. If happiness goes too low, crime increases. To offset an increase in crime and restore the balance, one can place a police station to lower crime around a given radius, making the distances between residential and commercial zones larger, or put trees up to reduce noise. Notice that all of this is entirely abstract. None of this makes any reference whatsoever to the design of an actual city. It could all be done on graph paper with zero attention paid to any of the material features of an actual place. The walking distance, say, between facilities has no significance. The appearance of the city has no significance. It is as if humans don't live here, only numbers do, which of course is the case. SimCity, the precursor and inspiration for City Skylines and virtually every other city building game that exists, was inspired by a now mostly forgotten book called Urban Dynamics, written by J. Wright Forrester and MIT computer scientist, engineer, and the inventor of system dynamics, quote-unquote. Some history. In the 1950s, the company General Electric, hereafter referred to as GE, was dealing with an employment instability problem. Note, I regrettably can't reference this properly because not only is the supporting reference in Wikipedia a dead link, there doesn't appear to be any record of it anywhere else on the internet. I also found that on the website this missing article once appeared in, I couldn't use the drop-down menu options because the website's search bar sits comically over top of them, obstructing its use. At the very least, we can be certain that civil engineers designed this website, but I digress. GE had an employment instability problem that seemed to exhibit a consistent 3-year cycle, and external causes like the business cycle were unsatisfying as explanations. Forrester was able to use abstract simulations of the stock flow feedback structure of GE's plants to show how the internal structure of GE was to blame for the cycle of employment instability and not external economic forces like the business cycle, as some had postulated. Without getting into the details which vastly outstrip my competence, this is the essence of systems dynamics. The use of abstract models to define the boundaries of a system, identify the important values and the flows between them, and simulate the changes, the dynamics, of the values within that system based on the movements represented by the model. And SimCity is essentially a very simple form of such a model. The aim of the game being to find the most efficient and/or elegant way to manipulate given inputs to achieve the most optimal outputs. The result is a game in which, no matter which way you slice it, nothing truly resembling a city ever materializes. There are no active communities making decisions or making demands on the city leadership. There are no class divisions or alliances based on the unequal structuring of the urban sprawl to benefit some groups over others, or against the destruction of the natural environment, or for the defense of areas and buildings of cultural significance. There is only the grid and the numerical values assigned to its squares. It is so reductive, in fact, that an optimal city can be designed that also maximizes the misery of its population. This was something famously demonstrated by Vincent Acosta's SimCity project Magnasanti, which was crime-free and had a populations table at 6 million Sims, but which also lacked schools, fire stations, and hospitals, and in which the life expectancy of the unfortunate Sims was 50 years. Despite the attempts by some developers to simulate actual individual human activity, 3 Division's Soviet Union-themed city builder Workers and Resources Soviet Republic seems to have gone the farthest in this regard, city building games have never shed this abstract, simplified, systems dynamics style approach that reduces things like city health to a crude system of abstract values and exchanges. There's a wonderful article by Kevin T. Baker, which I'll link in the description, called Model Metropolis, that goes into the development of SimCity more deeply, and how Forrester's ideologically conservative conceptions of society informed the particular relations between the values of public order, happiness, law enforcement, crime, poverty, and so on that he gives in Urban Dynamics, and were ultimately simplified and represented in games like SimCity and its imitators, and how seemingly intuitive assumptions like the presence of a sufficiently resourced police force can be enough to maintain social stability give rise to such absurd extremes as in the Magnasanti experiment. But this is possible because methodologies like systems dynamics are ultimately just tools, and seemingly ideologically neutral ones, anyone can use them. Whatever values you think are important are the values that it will take into account, and nothing about systems dynamics requires you to include or exclude, limit or expand any of the conceptions or misconceptions you brought along with you in your intellectual backpack. The catch is that this makes it a wonderful tool of reification. Reification is what happens when things that are strictly ideological are treated as if they are concrete and real, usually by not reflecting on the terms that make them up. What methodologies like systems dynamics allow city planners, say, to do is to imagine that they've done a thorough analysis without ever interrogating the ideological assumptions that are feeding into it, elevating what is in fact just a method for structuring the implications of common prejudices and opinions into something that resembles a scientific analysis. Who needs critical theory? We have a method. But I want to focus in particular on the fact of the abstraction itself, because this in itself isn't exactly new. Human dwellings were subject to abstract planning without any reference to on-the-ground particulars of place, culture, and so on, long before Forrester put pen to paper and tried to apply his systems dynamics to urban design. In his book, Seeing Like a State, the late anarchist political scientist James C. Scott contrasts various top-down despotic overcoding approaches to politics and statecraft that stamp over and erase organic human communities with ideal models, with more ecologically sensitive approaches that emerge from within these communities and respect them. In particular, in a chapter on the high modernist city, Scott discusses approaches to urban design which attempt to solve social issues within already existing communities without taking any care or heed for the particular features, histories, and forms of life of the social ecosystems that are already there, insisting instead on clearing it out in favor of making the landscape legible and more easily manipulable. This approach is epitomized in Scott's book by the character of the Swiss architect and urban planner Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, better known as Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier's philosophy to design is hierarchical and linear. The ideal city for Le Corbusier is ordered like a pyramid, the topmost authority determining the way of life of those at the bottom by command, with a rigid segregation of city districts according to function, and straight roads arranged on a grid system that makes impossible the mess and tangle that happens when you have an organically developed community that has established itself through on-the-ground, practical negotiations with its environment and with each other, and which has lived through multiple revolutions of technology. Quote, "An infinity of combinations is possible when innumerable and diverse elements are brought together, but the human mind loses itself and becomes fatigued by such a labyrinth of possibilities. Control becomes impossible. The spiritual failure that must result is disheartening. Reason is an unbroken straight line. Thus, in order to save himself from this chaos, in order to provide himself with a bearable, acceptable framework for his existence, one productive of human well-being and control, man has projected the laws of nature into a system that is a manifestation of the human spirit itself. Geometry." Unquote. Scott opposes the approach of Le Corbusier with that of American-Canadian urban theorist and activist Jane Jacobs, who insists rather on the importance of organic, bottom-up human development. Human life doesn't order itself in straight lines, and far from making life bearable and ordered, rigid segregation of work, commerce, home, and recreation from each other destroys the deep, textured, and robust order that arises organically from human beings actually having to learn to live with one another over time and having to mingle with each other despite their diverse and distinct businesses and activities. Quote, "For Jacobs, the city as a social organism is a living structure that is constantly changing and springing surprises. Its interconnections are so complex and dimly understood that planning always risks unknowingly cutting into its living tissue, thereby damaging or killing vital social processes." Unquote. And, quote, "For Jacobs, how a city develops is something like how a language evolves. A language is the joint historical creation of millions of speakers. Although all speakers have some effect on the trajectory of a language, the process is not particularly egalitarian. Linguists, grammarians, and educators, some of them backed by the power of the state, weigh in heavily. But the process is not particularly amenable to a dictatorship, either. Despite the efforts toward central planning, quote-unquote, language, especially its everyday spoken form, stubbornly tends to go on its own rich, multivalent, colorful way. Similarly, despite the attempts by urban planners toward designing and stabilizing the city, it escapes their grasp. It is always being reinvented and inflected by its inhabitants." Unquote. Which of these two approaches is most correct is well illustrated by Scott through two example model cities designed according to Le Corbusier's principles: Brasilia in Brazil and Chandigarh in India. We'll focus on Brasilia. Quote, "One striking result of Brasilia's cityscape is that virtually all the public spaces in the city are officially designated public spaces. The stadium, the theater, the concert hall, the planned restaurants. The smaller, unstructured, informal public spaces, sidewalk cafes, street corners, small parks, neighborhood squares, do not exist. Paradoxically, a great deal of nominally open space characterizes this city, as it does Le Corbusier's city plans. But that space tends to be, quote-unquote, dead space." Unquote. While clear and legible to an administrative center and undeniably impressive from the sky, Brasilia was a social desert. Wide open spaces were prohibitive to organic mingling among the population, and the absence of any unstructured sources of spontaneous social interaction like cafes and parks were simply not present. Brasilia was, as planned, closer to a colossal mall with housing sectors. The very possibility of community was essentially kept away from the city by design, and the result was the stillbirth of public life. But since public life in Brasilia was planned, or planned out of it as it were, from the top down, in advance of anyone actually having to live there, at least it shouldn't have involved the frustrating or breaking down of any already existing communities, right? Well, as a wise mathematician once said, life, finds a way. You see, Brasilia had to be built. It was built by a huge population of manual laborers and their families who had to be housed. This resulted in a sitting population that quickly outstripped its allotted dwellings and ended up expanding their territory through makeshift housing, who eventually organized together demanding recognition and city services, with the result that by, quote, 1980, 75% of the population of Brasilia lived in settlements that had never been anticipated, while the planned city had reached less than half of its projected population of 557,000, unquote. Incredibly, it turns out, human societies are made up of humans. Cities are made up of people. Humans are animals. They move, they socialize, they have complex desires that connect them in diverse and complicated ways across vast distances and myriad intersections. Some are hard to perceive from a distance. Humans are not reducible to the simple streams of energy that are solely of interest to a despotic top-down administrator with no stake or experience in the actual life of the community as it is lived on the ground. This is what Jane Jacobs means in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, when she declares in a chapter entitled Visual Order, Its Limitations and Possibilities, that, quote, "the city cannot be a work of art," unquote. Quote, "Art has its own peculiar forms of order, and they are rigorous. Artists, whatever their medium, make selections from the abounding materials of life and organize these selections into works that are under the control of the artist. To approach a city, or even a city neighborhood, as if it were a larger architectural problem, capable of being given order by converting it into a disciplined work of art, is to make the mistake of attempting to substitute art for life. The results of such profound confusion between art and life are neither life nor art, they are taxidermy. Like all attempts at art which get away from the truth and which lose respect for what they deal with, this craft of city taxidermy becomes, in the hands of its master practitioners, continually more picky and precious. This is the only form of advance possible to it." Unquote. Attempts to order human life artistically, by diagram, however elegant that diagram is, will always fail because life overflows any conceivable diagram. Moreover, life, desiring and gregarious, Google that word, is driven to overflow these diagrams, often violently. Which brings us, of course, to Final Fantasy VII by Square Enix. Citybuilders aren't the only kinds of games that depict principles of urban design, after all. One of my recent favorites for this is the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, as a game, I prefer the original Final Fantasy VII. It's less bloated, less pretentious, less wordy, and the remake's grittier post-Advent children art style just lacks that late 90s je ne sais quoi of the original. Both versions of Final Fantasy VII, however, begin by depicting a two-tiered city-state called Midgar. The top tier is a colossal metal plate, scathingly referred to by some characters as a big pizza that is literally suspended above the ground and divided radially into 8 sections. The tier below the plate is similarly segmented according to those same segments into numbered districts, and is comprised of an extensive network of slums, the neglected remnants on the ground of the communities that originally came together to form the city upon which that colossal megastructure is stamped. Without getting too deep into the weeds of Final Fantasy VII lore, the plate exists because the corporation that controls Midgar, the Shinra Electric Power Company, has caused such intense environmental destruction through its energy extraction practices that it has built upwards in order to provide its leadership and wealthier members a place to live that is insulated from the environmental decay. As it happens, city life on top of the plate is ordered similarly like a typical modern city in our world, albeit more extremely. The 8 segments of the plate comprise suburban housing, business, cultural and recreational centers, largely cordoned off from each other, and the slums beneath the plate are largely divided up in a similar way, which is not unusual for an urban setting in a video game, since representing the full complexity of an actual city takes a lot of work, as well as a prohibitive amount of rendering power. But as a result of this, the Final Fantasy VII Remake inherits a world design that lets us actually walk these 2 different styles of urban planning, and see firsthand the intrinsic flaws in the abstract, diagrammatic, and despotic style of urban simulators and planners like Forrester and Le Corbusier. One really cool thing about the Final Fantasy VII Remake that you can't do in the original is actually walk the slums, so let's do that. The slums are an assortment of relatively evenly spaced structures assembled on an ad hoc basis from materials, mostly scrap, acquired as the opportunity provides. There is a more or less even mix of residential, commercial, and recreational buildings, no one dominating any given space over the others, and the major landmarks are public recreational centers, which means that life can be convincingly depicted as happening everywhere all at once. Any assortment of people talking, laughing, walking, etc. is justified, because everywhere is somewhere for someone to want to be. Now let's look at the suburbs on top of the plate. We walk empty streets, which could be explained by it being nighttime, but I rather view this as an unconscious accommodation to an ideological preconception. Put more simply, suburbs are naturally socially dead. Why? Because in suburbs there is nothing but housing. Housing and road. Often there aren't even sidewalks, and the logic is simple. Extensive houses with marketable features like front yards and backyards and driveways and white picket fences can be easily slotted side by side en masse in a single unmixed zone. The problem is that by becoming only one kind of place, suburbs become no kind of place. There are only 2 places to go when you live in a suburb, and that is home or out of the suburb. If you're lucky, there's a cafe or a school to function as a kind of third place to meet with people nearby, but generally, there's nothing. Certainly no reason for people who don't live in the suburb to go to the suburb. Suburbs aren't places where community happens. They are docks on land where working people park their cars and live entirely in de facto seclusion. Walk any suburb in the summer, and you will find mostly empty streets. The Final Fantasy VII Remake, which conspicuously lacks a day and night cycle, chooses to depict the suburban residential areas of the plate at night because the developers realized, I believe, that if it was depicted during the day, there would be no way to convincingly place the NPCs, because why would anyone be there? This is a missed opportunity for a critique that wouldn't be out of place at all in Final Fantasy VII, with its all too direct and obvious analogies to the anti-human oppression of settler colonialism and capitalism and the sterility of overcoding by central administrative state structures and technology. I mean, one of the heads of Shinra is literally called Heidegger. But, alas. The Final Fantasy VII Remake is interesting in an additional way, however. Final Fantasy VII, in both versions, is about, in the beginning at least, a failed revolution. James Scott follows up his chapter on the high modernist city with a discussion of a disagreement between two revolutionary socialists, Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. As before, the high modernist in this story is the man. Vladimir Lenin feared community. He feared the corrupting dynamism and lack of planned resolve of the common folk. This is why he argued for the need of an insular and strictly disciplined ideological vanguard to lead the revolution, so that the weakness and self-interest and stupidity of the common man wouldn't corrupt the reason of the revolutionary leadership and undermine the greater purpose. Luxembourg, a schoolteacher by profession, disputed this. An insulated vanguard is doomed to stagnation, unable to be changed by interaction with the creative powers of the people, and the people in turn would be stunted in their creative development and potential by being tyrannized over by such a cloistered elite group. It may seem trite to say out loud, but the Final Fantasy VII Remake actually makes Luxembourg's point visually apparent in a fairly poignant way. Let's look again at the slums of Midgar. You can literally see its potential for revolutionary and creative action. Humans are able to interact with each other spontaneously. Even though oppressed and impoverished, the community is visibly rich. Everyone is outside, talking to each other, connecting with and changing each other. This is a gregarious and dynamic existence. By contrast, the suburbs on top of the plate, while rich in material, are socially destitute. It is shown only at night, so there is an alibi for why no social life is depicted, because in fact, there would be no believable social life to depict. No flower can bloom in such desolate, infertile soil. The developers, I believe, have instinctively regarded this as a weakness of imagination to be worked around, when I personally think it is the greatest strength of the medium. Video games like Final Fantasy VII can sometimes let you see in an immersive way just how odd, how strange, how unhuman it looks when what should be there isn't. When what one would like to see present, what one would need to be present to feel fulfilled, simply isn't there. Simply can't be there. The slums of Midgar, impoverished, convincingly also harbor a festering ebullition of human social life, capable of bubbling over in revolutionary action, causing real destabilizations and changes in the world. There is creative possibility in this impoverished, buried wreck of a society. The suburbs of the plate, by contrast, are passive and inert. Their desires and energies are channeled away from what little exists of their communal life towards the ends of a centralized industrial colonial administrative system that only sees in diagrams and breathes in numbers, their life spilling out the other end as so much smoke, while they retire at the end of the day spent in a fete to their fenced lawns and homes, essentially domestic-themed coffins. The perverse siphoning by the state into the belly of capital of all the energy that would otherwise be able to fuel a living social life that might be capable of collective action and spontaneity renders the creative and revolutionary capacity of this bourgeois upper plate society effectively neuter. In conclusion, I think my childhood intuition was correct. City building games felt empty to me. They felt sterile because they are. By design, and accidentally all at once. Their ambition is innocently to simulate how a city works. And to simulate, you require not the history and lived experience of a real, organic community, but mere premises, mere axioms. This value relates to this value in this way in this proportion at all times. But this isn't life. This is, as Jacobs put it, taxidermy. The only potential for growth in such a system is an increasing pickiness, dividing the diagram up into more and more finer lines, multiplying the variables until life is recreated through a sheer multiplication of cuts. All fine on paper, and that's what city building games are, ideal models that could function equally well with no graphics at all. Models that are only able to appear to live through their very deadness. These aren't things that are dynamic, these are rippling chains of cut-apart segments, that appear so vast in their complexity they imitate life on the screen, but fundamentally everything is already predetermined and there is no possibility of anything new. And that's what life is about. Creativity. The emergence of new things interacting dynamically with an environment, but truly dynamically. Not the taxidermied, frozen vegetable version of dynamics that systems dynamics represents, but real change. Real holistic, ecological, merging, melding, and communicating with an environment. That, unfortunately, can't be simulated. But you can simulate war pretty well, which is one of the reasons why Age of Empires is better. I hope this was interesting. If you want to read more on urban planning, I can't recommend enough James C. Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, as well as The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. I could also recommend Lewis Mumford's wonderful book, wonderfully huge book, The City in History. All will be linked in the description. As always, thank you for listening, and take care.
What am I gonna do?
Netanyahu's... Benjamin Netanyahu's...
top guy! What am I gonna do?
Like, they weren't in the same century! Look at Rowling's Potter series and the Quidditch game. YouTube's wonderful praise Google. Said before, it's a statute of limitations. Rats!